Keep in touch with the Wolf Connection Podcast on our Instagram handle at the Wolf Connection Pod, or email us your questions, comments, and guest ideas to podcast@wolfconnection.org. Thank you for your support, and howls to you all. Welcome to the Wolf Connection Podcast. I'm your host, John Kaufman. Really some exciting new research, exciting things that are happening in Yellowstone as always, but this is really something that is, I think, brand new to the research space. And we're talking about bioacoustics, and we're going to talk to the man who's really sort of in charge of that. He's the software engineer for the Yellowstone National Park Wolf Project. He also has a PhD in computational linguistics. So he really knows his stuff. He's coming to us from Paradise Valley, Montana, and that is Jeff Reed. Jeff, it's a pleasure to finally meet you and pick your brain about all this really new and exciting stuff. How are you doing?
Good, John. Thank you so much. Appreciate your interest and happy to share as much as we can today.
Absolutely. And we're going to be, as we go through this and in the description of the episode of you that are listening to this, we're going to have a lot of different links, a lot of different places for you to go to really get the full grasp of what Jeff and I are talking about today and how you can show your interest, how you can donate, and really help this research go on. But Jeff, for everybody who's listening, just tell everybody your upbringing. I know I was reading a little bit about your bio. You grew up in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. This was your backyard as a kid, it seemed. What was that like for you as a child to be in this space, and now you're working and doing your job in the space where you grew up, kind of?
Yeah, I'm getting old, John. I was born in '67, born in Billings, Montana, and raised in Paradise Valley, which is essentially the northern range of what are called the Absaroka Mountains, and just north of Yellowstone Park. And I, of course, is like most Montana kids, I hunted, hiked, fished, and looked for arrowheads all around that area when I was a kid. My dad was a math teacher, which was nice because we had the summers off, and many of his colleagues were rangers in Yellowstone during the summer months. So we spent a lot of time in Yellowstone. And of course, by dating myself, I grew up prior to the reintroduction of wolves in Yellowstone. But then I lived through it kind of right when I was doing my PhD, right before that. And then, of course, have lived after that all the way till today.
What was that like for you to be growing up prior to the reintroduction, where wolves were very scarce, if at all, on the landscape, to them being introduced and now being in the middle of the reintroduction being done 30 years in? What's that timeline like for you as you look back on all that?
Yeah, well, before the reintroduction, like, you don't know what you don't know, right? I mean,
right.
You're not hearing them, you don't, like, you live in this vacuum of what humans used to know very well, right? We co-evolved with wolves. They and us, had an influence on, becoming dogs. But when you don't know it, you don't know it. So whatever information you get is being sent to you by other people who don't know a whole lot. And I grew up in a ranching and farming family and an oil and gas family. And, there are all sorts of perspectives. The nice thing about growing up in a ranching family is people like that enjoy the outdoors. They enjoy ecosystems. Not everybody hates wolves in the ranching industry. But at the same time, wolves can be a hassle to a rancher. So that's all I knew. And then when they were reintroduced, man, that was, frankly, chaos and all sorts of opinions, all sorts of politics. And you see that today in Colorado. So now in hindsight, looking back, it's like, yeah, we all survived. It's not like everybody agrees or gets along, but it wasn't as big of a deal as it was at the time.
Yeah, like you said, living in a vacuum and getting those different perspectives, and you're probably in one of the few in the unique position where you're prior, during, and now after, to be able to really witness that firsthand, which is a unique perspective that probably only a handful, maybe a dozen or so people can really say that they were there through all of that. Where does the computational linguistic side come for you to then merge into biology? You said your father was a math teacher. is that where you got sort of your, I don't know, your itch to do what you do to study for your PhD and then bring it over into the biology side and for the research side? How did that marry itself?
Yeah, not really. I have a weird past, but I mean, I turned down Stanford to go to this private Christian college in Los Angeles, and my mom's never forgiven me, of course. But I really wanted to study anthropology, and they had a really good anthropology department because at Christian colleges, there often is a missionary school, right? For good or bad, like I'm not really asking people's opinions on that, but they have some of the best anthropologists in the world because those anthropologists actually go and study, different cultures. They go and live with them and they get to know them and they learn their language. And so that's where I really got introduced to linguistics and had a really great professor in language theory that steered me away from Chomsky and linguistics, which is a whole nother side topic. And I went and did a PhD in kind of what's called systemic functional linguistics that has a heritage in computational linguistics. So at the time, this was way before AI, right? We were, ever since Aristotle, people have been trying to figure out supposedly why humans only have language. And it's never been solved, right? Until maybe 2017 when Google's BERT and then OpenAI's chat really started to be able to at least put together comprehensive long sentences in a way that you could read them. Well, up till that time, it was just a bunch of people sitting in a room theorizing about how does language work. And that philosophical tradition goes all the way back to Aristotle. And, why are humans different than animals? Right? So that bias has been here for a long time. And then, more recently, biologists have been like, yeah, well, okay, maybe or maybe not, they don't have human language, but they have a lot of other communication systems that are interesting. So that was my heritage. And because of the anthropology side, I knew that language is something that is used by real people. It's not something you study in a book or learn by pulling out a dictionary. You have to go live with people. And the same is true with animals. If you want to understand why a wolf howls, you have to learn their culture. And so that was kind of the heritage of what got me here. Of course, I had to earn a living. And so I was a software engineer for a long time, still dabbling in linguistics and then moving into AI as that evolved. And then because of where I grew up, I was like getting bored of studying human languages. Like trillions of dollars go into studying human languages and creating generative AI and that sort of stuff. And we spend hardly anything on the last remaining 6% of, wildlife that's on the planet. So that was kind of my Einstein moment, if I put it that way.
Wow. You just said something so profound too about not just the dollar figure, but understanding that we have, as you say, 6% of other wildlife on this planet that really doesn't, it gets studied, but not to the degree that obviously human sort of studies happen. And we had a podcast with Dr. Mark Beckhoff when he was talking about the emotional side of wildlife and animals and how these types of terms are starting to turn in a more positive or accepted direction, in that people are understanding animals, whether they be megafauna, mammals, reptiles, insects, there is an emotion there for one benefit one way or the other. Is that what you are seeing as we get into animal communication and starting to, I guess, really just scratch the surface of this at this point, that people are, there's more of an acceptance around, hey, obviously, I think people know animals communicate, but there is this very real sets of languages within population sets as we go through. Obviously, wolves is what we're going to touch on today, but I know dolphins and orcas and, animals like that, people understand that there is this really diverse language that is out there.
Yeah, whales and elephants, and the list goes on and on. Now,
right.
as someone else once said, I am no Mark Bekoff. And what an amazing person he is, and biologist. So I just look at the biology world from the outside, and, his work on, emotional states is fascinating, and I buy it. Partly because I spend a lot of time with wildlife.
Right.
I've raised a baby pronghorn before, and those sorts of experiences really help you start seeing individuals in species. I do not think that the notion of language in animals has caught up in the biology world. That is very taboo. And I mean, I'll throw it out there. I personally think that when biologists want to say animals communicate, they don't have language, I'm like, okay, define language. And then you see them go in this circular reasoning loop where you're like, well, yeah, you didn't, all you ended up defining was human language. Okay, great. But have you defined this thing called language? And so I think that's where I'm hoping to push people as a linguist who comes in and looks at this and goes, well, there's a lot of things in wolf communication that we can draw parallels from human language. I'm not saying wolves are going to write a Shakespearean, sonnet anytime soon. I'm really interested in what language do they have, and I'm interested, like most evolutionary ecologists, on what were the evolutionary underpinnings to our language, right, and their language. I think those are fascinating questions. Whether we'll ever answer them, I mean, Stephen Mithran's new book, is an epic treatise on try to answer that. We'll see what the academics say in return. But and you can take the Tukadiga, the mountain Shoshone, and they were called by the early trappers in the Northwest. They were referred to as the trappers as having this amazing ability to imitate any species. And, we don't like to call that talking with, but in some ways it is talking with. And so clearly indigenous cultures and cultures from the far past all across the world had a different relationship with animals from a communication standpoint. And then, science really tried to start defining that. And I personally, I'm not going to say wolves, we're going to create Google Translate for wolves anytime soon, or whales for that matter, or elephants. I don't think that's the point. The point is learning their language. And then with that comes understanding, right? And like Mark's shown, you can start getting at emotional states and other sorts of things. The biggest problem, like today, is not just in science, but in common parlance. We often talk about wolves as having song or music. We often use terms like music with,
right.
And we do it with birds. Birds have nothing to do, their songs have nothing to do with music. It's get the hell out of here, right? Or come sleep with me. It's one of those two. And the context will determine what it means. And I think we don't do wolves a service if we keep thinking of them in terms of this music that they're producing. They are communicating, and we should hopefully want to go learn what that communication means to them.
Yeah, I feel you in that way, because you're right, is that we tend to, as humans, as a species, try to put everything in a nice, neat box. And typically that's not the way nature has gone for millions of years, or, tens of thousands, hundreds, however, whatever your belief system is in that way. Nature has done its own thing for much longer than we've been present on this earth, in a way in which we've been able to understand our own language. And like you said, dumping a lot of money into figuring out human linguistics over the course of time and going that way. In that light, discuss what really the main mission then of the Cry Wolf Project is, because you really have gotten into wanting to understand this language or understand what some of the, like you said, maybe not exactly what it means, but where we can kind of go from here. So what's really the mission and the goal of the project that's been going on for roughly 2 years, when you and I were discussing off camera?
Yeah, I mean, we've got multiple, whatever you want to call them, bullets to our mission.
Right.
I mean, I mentioned kind of the first one is just re-engage people in the lost art of listening to wildlife. Like we walk around with headphones now, and there's a reason, right? No one wants to hear the motorcycle chopper going by their house, or the jackhammer outside. And so we're covering that up, that loss, with other things, including our form of music and podcasts, and the list goes on. If we can re-engage people with the sound that is out there, maybe they will care more about protecting that sound. And that sound goes along with the animals. So that is a heavy conservation goal of ours. But there are some other tactical things we're trying to do. Bioacoustics as a low-cost population and presence or occupancy modeling tool. Wolves are hard to count, right? And that leads to what I call politicians saying whatever they want, right, about populations. And that's not good for anybody. Whether you overestimate or underestimate, no one wins. So bioacoustics is a low-cost modeling tool to improve existing models. Wolves are loud, right? We can often pick them up from about 6 kilometers away. And so that's a much cheaper way than hiring a bunch of people to run around and try to find wolves and count them. So that's one of the big goals that I think a lot of wildlife managers across the world that reach out to us are also interested in. To get there, we need better tools for ecologists. Most camera traps, for example, are foreign made, and they're really for the hunting industry, and they frankly suck. They're not that good. And if American VCs and the ESG kind of network would invest even part of the money they spend on other things, we would have camera traps with audio traps in them as well that are lower cost for places like the Park Service or conservation organizations to go and monitor the landscape. I'll give you a simple example. There's a really good company in North America called Wildlife Acoustics that makes amazing acoustic recorders. But if we go study a den site and we're trying to figure out how pups are learning certain vocalizations, and if they are learning certain vocalizations, we can't disrupt that site, right? We have to put a recorder out, and we've got to have it last. Nor do we want to use a bunch of solar panels, right, to put out and be more invasive. And so by what we're trying to build are recorders that can last 6 months to 12 months and record 24/7, and then we take that data and analyze it. But the problem is, if you're recording 24/7 on a landscape, I don't know how old you are, John. I'm old. When the Sony Walkmans we had in the 80s with the cassette, remember the cassette tapes?
I remember those. Yep.
How long did they record for? You remember?
I think it was 60 minutes, right? 60 or 90 if you got the extent.
Yeah, 60 to 90, right? It's 60 on average. If we put one recorder out on the landscape, that's 8,760 of those cassette tapes. Well, now we can put them on a device the size of my thumb. But how do I go find the wolves in that massive amount of data? And that's where AI is proving a tool to do that. So if we can detect them, then we can start getting a sense for their presence. And then there's some other really tough problems we're working on to count them.
Right.
If we can count them, then we can model that. So those are some of the goals. I'm personally interested in what is the wolf's word. I lean more towards the curiosity side of things. We in no other species on the planet do we know what a word is. It doesn't matter what you're reading recently on elephants using names, anything else. If you look at those studies, they don't know where the word is, for the other elephant's name. They just know it's in there because they're seeing a behavioral response.
They're seeing behavioral response. Okay.
All of ChatGPT and Claude and all those things are based on the assumption that when we store stuff on the internet, we are storing it in a way that we know the words. And so we can generate these large language models because of that. Well, if you don't know the word in a wolf, how do you even use the tools to get there? So there's some of that I'm interested in. I'm very interested in the evolution of canid language. How does your dog vocalize differently than a wolf? That's a fascinating topic we could talk about. What about coyotes? Like, are they the same as wolves, different than wolves in terms of vocalizations? And then lastly, because of my heritage in the ranching world, you know, I don't know if you've, well, I'm sure you have heard of rag boxes where people play sounds to deter predators from an environment, right?
Yeah.
Well, often you'll hear heavy metal, rock songs being played, firecrackers, those sorts of stuff. I'm like, okay, brute force, right? Let's use a little bit of science to say, if you were going to deter a wolf, what sounds would you play? We don't even know yet how a wolf hears in their cochlea. So, you know, there's some grand assumptions being made with rag boxes that some science could maybe help make those more effective. So those are some of the goals.
There's so many different things to touch on there, and it really is incredibly fascinating of where just the rabbit holes, you know, figuratively and literally, that you can go down talking about all of this stuff. For you, talk about too, because I was I was listening to your presentation that you gave me on YouTube, which we'll have in the description so you guys can all listen to it, look at it. When you're talking about AI, picking out these specific, well, you know, picking out wolf howls and wolf communication, you talk about reading a spectrogram and what exactly that is. And I know visually anybody who's listening to this can't visually see what that is, but in the best way possible, discuss how you're able to parse out the wolves from, you know, elk, you know, mountain lion, bison, when any other animal, obviously, it's going to be on that landscape for that 6 to 12 month period. Because I did see that too in your talk, that these, I think they're cards. I don't know if you guys have cards in there, but I think it was 18 terabytes or something like that of storage space that you guys have available on those recorders, correct? Or it might be higher than that.
18 terabytes is what we store annually.
Well, you store it annually?
Okay.
Okay.
Recorders, you can store from 256 gig to 4 to 8 terabytes. Storage is no longer an issue.
Right.
Tech is like moving that really fast forward. So yeah, the storage is there for people to record indefinitely. And for those of you who want to learn a spectrogram, if you remind me, John, I'll send you to a link where they can either watch that talk or I've got a little shorter video on just spectrograms. Like,
sure. Yeah, no, we'd love that.
Like really high level. You don't have to worry about it.
Sure.
The dirty little secret in animal AI, animal communication AI or bioacoustics is that what we actually do is we convert the audio to a spectrogram, which is just a visual representation of sound. And the y-axis, the low pitches down low, higher up high. The x-axis is time, sound over time. And then the brightness of the color of the sound that spectrogram indicates amplitude or what you perceive as loudness. Those three variables are in a spectrogram. And one thing about the human brain is right? And it's why Facebook exists, right? And Mark Zuckerberg really wants to know what face you just posted on Facebook. We use the same technology that they're using for facial recognition detection for audio with spectrograms to figure out what is it that sound made. Of what we do, and having a lot of data makes that AI a lot better. Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah. So So the AI is going to pluck this out. And when you guys have done this, you know, because you've obviously had research, you've obviously had, you know, separations of audio that's come in. You guys have been able to share this with the public, share this with people. What have been some of the things that you have all found out? I was reading in there that there's, I think on the low end, 20 different call types, anywhere between 20 to 50, something like that. What are the frequencies in terms of hertz that these communications live on? There's a lot of interesting things that maybe people don't understand or know, because they can hear wolf howls fairly regularly if they want to when they go to the park, or if they go to a sanctuary and things like that. And they may wonder, where on the audio plane do these howls or calls or everything else live on, and how many types of calls are there, and have you or anybody else defined, you know, I've gotten like the finite number, because we may only have 20 to 50, but there may be upwards of who knows how many, 100, 200.
Yeah. Simply put, there are long range vocalizations from wolves and short range. The long range ones are what we're familiar with, howls and then chorus howls. Wolves were one of a few species that collectively communicate in a chorus howl where they participate together. Those can travel a long distance, and the AI can handle those fairly easy. The short range communication, like whimpers, whines, moans, certain calls like whoas, and even barks don't travel as far as a howl. We are not training the AI to find those right now. So I manually find those, and we will build AI for that for the future. But our main mission right now is with howls and chorus howls. The joy I get is I open up a spectrogram on a big screen. It's 1 hour long. So imagine if I had to listen to all of the audio I get from the park, I think I calculated it would take, I'm now up to like 120 years where I'd have to just sit there and listen to it. So obviously that's not going to happen. But if I pull up these spectrograms, linguists can get really good, and spectrograms work for all sorts of things, not just animal wolves. They're used to study us too. And so linguists can be so good that they can look at a spectrogram and they can know what you're saying. So they can just know that John just said, I am a nuthatch, just by looking at the spectrogram. So once you get good at it, I can open a 1 hour spectrogram and I can go wolves, coyotes, bison, grizzly bear, people, you know, you name it. You know, I am pretty good with birds. I am not like, you know, your freakish neighbor who knows every variant of a white-crowned sparrow. But you can start going ravens. You can just see it in the spectrogram. And so you can do a lot with these spectrograms without having to listen to the entire sound, just to find what you're interested in, and then listen to that particular thing. So that's how we do it manually. And then the AI does it for us at grand scale.
What have you seen, or what types of communication? Because I guess we're talking more about the chorus howls and the group howls and the things that you can pick up. And you did send me a howl from 907F, who we spoke about at length with Kira Cassidy. What are some of the findings, or what are the main pieces that you're taking away so far from the early parts of these bioacoustics? Are we looking at wolves tend to howl more often than people think? Are they communicating with other packs in different ways? Are there more whimpers and whines and moans than that are obviously in a different frequency? What are the main takeaways thus far that you're able to share with anybody who's interested or listening to this right now about how wolves are communicating and what it could lead to meaning? Not that you guys have the definitive answer just yet.
Yeah. And let me just qualify. The AI is really, what we're using it for is to find howls and chorus howls.
Sure.
Our recorders pick up everything.
Right.
And if they're near enough to the pack, they're going to hear all sorts of short range communication. And I promise you, unless you have a wolf sanctuary or you're around wolves in a captive setting, And what I would love to do someday is compare what I'm hearing with what you're hearing and see if wild wolves are doing some things. I hear some things, I'm like, what the heck is that? And I know it's coming from a wolf because I've got the context, but they're making sounds I have no clue on. So I think that's the beauty of this, is there's stuff we're never going to figure out, but there's a lot more talking going on at close range. I have this great recording of two wolves doing kind of what I call close range howls, where they're not trying to reach out and touch everybody, and they're going back and forth. And these two ravens are in the background going back and forth. And it's almost like there's a conversation going on here. So there's plenty of these close range vocalizations that we're going to learn a lot about. Now, back to the long range vocalizations, the simplest thing we learned is no one has ever sat outside 24/7 for an entire year and written down how many times do these wolves howl and chorus howl. No one's ever done that. Most researchers are out in the day, first of all. Right? Most of us know wolves are pretty vocal in the evening and dawn.
Dawn, right.
But what we learned is that they're consistently vocal at night. Like 1 a.m., midnight, 11 p.m., 2 a.m. They're so consistent that 3 out of 4 days in the greater Yellowstone, they chorus howl.
Really?
And so the only time they vocalize more in the daytime, not more than at night, but they vocalize a lot in the daytime, is during the breeding season, January through March. You get a lot more daytime vocalizations, but they're consistent in their nighttime vocalizations. Now that's in the greater Yellowstone, right? I'm studying whether they do that as much outside of the park, which I've found they do, where there's more human dominance and you can get shot, right? All sorts of things can happen to you. And others have studied in Spain and Italy and India. They tend not to vocalize as much as they're finding here in Yellowstone. One of my hypotheses is that it might be because there's not as many other wolves. I think wolves chorus howl primarily to tell another pack that this is our territory. And they don't necessarily shut up just because humans are around, because they want to tell that other pack. They might shut up if there aren't a lot of other packs around. Right? They might be more quiet. So that's one thing we discovered in just the first year of study. That's interesting to know. You might not think it's revolutionary, but it's one way of how collecting all of this data can teach us something new about wolves. I see them really defend that territorial boundary that they have with chorus howls, and they can hear a long ways away. I recorded a wolf at a recorder, and I was there, and it did this kind of what I call kind of a raspy howl, a little bit of agitation in it. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. And when I finally pulled the recorder data later, by then I had learned that the Wolf Project team, this wolf was by itself. The rest of its pack was like, I think it was 8.5 miles away at a kill site on a carcass. And the wolf I heard, when it howled, I went and pulled the other recorder, which was closer to the pack that was distant. And I think it was Taylor or Jeremy, they were watching that pack, and they gave me the precise time of when that pack chorus howled. I calculated the time that it takes sound to travel across that distance, and that lone wolf that was near me howled immediately. Now, I didn't hear the other chorus howl, my ears are getting old, but that wolf heard it, and it was essentially, I believe, responding to the pack that was roughly 8 miles away. So we're also learning more about how far the sensitivity of their hearing to hear. And that becomes very important for knowing where your pack is and also where a rival pack is. I'm sure Kira or Taylor talked about the number one cause of death for wolves in the park is other wolves.
There's other wolves.
So
Yeah.
depending your territory and understanding when to talk, when not to talk is kind of an important topic.
That is crazy. So how quickly does sound, because you're able to calculate that, what's the speed at which sound is able to travel in that specific part of the park that you were listening in?
Yeah, I mean, you remember the old one Mississippi rule when lightning hits? That's kind of the best way I teach people. It's roughly 350 meters a second. And it depends upon the medium. Like sound travels faster through like metal or wood or water, for example, denser objects than it does air. But on average, you're getting that 350 meters a second. And if you're in Yellowstone or somewhere and you see a wolf howl off in the distance, just start counting. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi, 4 Mississippi, 5 Mississippi. If it gets to your ears at 5 Mississippi, it's a mile away, right? It's the same thing you're doing with lightning. You see lightning flash and you start counting, you're getting a sense of the distance that it travels. And so, on average, a wolf howl or a coarse howl is about 100 to 110 decibels. And that's the equivalent of you standing, roughly 2 meters in front of your car and someone honking the horn for 5 seconds. That's how loud it is. So that amplitude is traveling, at the speed of sound, and then it arrives. And you got to remember, like, the fact that wolves have to deal with that delay quite a bit is going to change your perception of the landscape. Humans are very close range talkers. We're a long ways away, but we invented something that lets us talk in real time. Right. So we don't yell much anymore, and we don't do what are called whistle languages, where shepherds and others, use a whistle to communicate at longer distances. Wolves live in a different world where that communication style has to deal with that delay. So that's another interesting one. I mean, I could go on and on and on.
That's great though. I mean, for 8 miles, that's just such an incredible feat of not only vocalizing, but then also hearing exactly what they're saying. Because I would just think throughout the course of human language, if we were to try and communicate with someone that's that far away, something's going to get lost, in the wind or whatever, but their hearing is so good that they're able to pick that up and obviously translate it to not even translate, hear what is being said or vocalized, and then know that, hey, there's a kill site, come meet us here, and however long it takes when they go 8 miles, which is pretty
that's
insane.
what we want to learn is, are there signals in that howl that say this is a kill site, or come here or go there? No one's proven that or figured that out yet. And it may not turn out to be. The howl may simply be, here I am. And the chorus howl may be, here we are. But I ran across one experience where I had enough data to know where these wolves were through GPS collars on the landscape. And the pack was back at the den, but one of the kind of beta males was out doing a hunting foray, and the pack at the den did a chorus howl. It was like, I think, midnight. And then I saw that this other wolf that was like 6 miles away didn't do anything. It was just kind of laying there. And then another chorus howl came from the den site. Didn't do anything. Then about an hour later, another chorus howl came from the den site. That wolf went straight back to the den. Straight back to the den. At the same time, the pack that was at the den, most of them, got up and left. And they went roughly in his direction. And he went back to the den. Now, this was during when the pups were born. And so I was curious, to say, okay, here's one data, N of 1, let's get more of these so that we can look at the signal of the chorus howl to see if gray wolves do something similar to African wild dogs, where African wild dogs will do this sneezing quorum. So if they want to go out on a pack hunt, you'll see this sneezing kind of communication to get a quorum to go. And so I'm interested in, does are there signals in that chorus howl that mean we're leaving now? So did that other wolf go, okay, they're leaving. I need to go back and do my job and make sure that I'm watching over the pups with the alpha female.
Wow.
So more of this we get, the more we'll start decoding wolf language, right? What it means to them, how they interpret it.
Man, what is your anticipation or your expectation? Because you were talking about some of the goals of the project, obviously, and we've spoken a little bit about the insights. Where and how do you think you'll be able to figure out if there is an actual wolf word, and if there actually has been this evolution of canid language, or if this language is genetically there for all of its domestic cousins or coyotes or any sort of branch for any canine species? Do you think this type of project over the course of time will be able to parse that out or figure that out, or is it too early to tell at this moment?
There will be some rabbit trails that end in nothing, and there will be some that end in something. I was talking to Dan Staler, who runs the Wolf Project and Elk Project and Cougar Project in Yellowstone, and I'm like, man, we are coming up with more ideas for PhDs than I could ever imagine. I mean, there are so many no one's ever really done an acoustic analysis of all canids and tried to say, just like linguists do, we study the evolution of human languages. There are like 6,000 languages in the world. And you can, by comparing them, you can get back in time to a proto-language. And
right, the basis.
Things I hear in coyotes and wolves where I'm like, I wonder if that's a proto word, right? That was, or phrase or sound that they shared with a common ancestor. And that stuck around. But languages change too, right? They change rapidly for humans, and they can change for other species. White-crowned sparrows get isolated, and it's been shown that they have dialects. Are there dialects that are going on? An interesting one is Vicente Palacios is a great Spanish researcher of wolves, and he and I'm forgetting the other person's name. I apologize in advance if she's listening. Have argued that it's possible that this disjointed howl is a dialect of North American gray wolves, and it's a howl that drops in frequency very rapidly. It's not ooh, it's ooh, ooh, ooh. It has this really punctuated drop, and they're not seeing that as much in European wolves. Is that a dialect to our wolves? So there's another topic that could be studied. The list goes on and on and on. In fact, so long I've forgotten your original question that I had other responses to.
No, I think you answered it to a degree. It's still in flux of finding out if there is going to be a wolf word. And as you said, sort of that base language where this all started from, or communication where this all started from, and has this evolved or stayed the same throughout the course of time as wolves have become domesticated into dogs, and we have coyotes and different types of canines across the landscape. It seems as though there's, as you say, endless possibilities or rabbit holes to be discovered that, like you say, will lead to nowhere or somewhere, which is always the fascinating part. I wanted to touch on something too that you mentioned in your talk about wolves communicating or possibly changing, I guess, changing their communication when human presence is close or in the vicinity of where they are. And so this is something I've always wondered. And when I give tours at our sanctuary, I typically tend to say that wolves won't bark like a dog would. But it seems as though they do have this similar reaction out in the wild. Is that something that you guys have been finding? That I think there was a point where you said in your talk that they had an alert that there was human presence, and then they chuffed or barked at them. Is that something that you guys are finding also, that there's different communications when humans are around, whether it's researchers or hikers or whatever it may be?
Yeah, and I think you could help with this too. I really want to say that yes, wolves have words. I don't think we're going to find that out. I think what we've got to prove is where is the word?
Right.
Set
That's what you're
aside
saying.
the notion of word for a second, because no one ever defines it. If you just think of a sound unit that has a function, it has a function in a context. Just broadly define it like that. Then lots of animals do that. Don't get hung up on the word. So wolves do that, right? Because they bark, right? They howl, they whimper, they whine. Those are sound units, and they don't use a bark when they whimper, and they don't use a whimper when they bark. So those are different functions, and so yeah, they have a language. The difference between our language and their language is an interesting one, but set that aside for a second. Now, barks are interesting because this is going to be highly debated. And Vicente was the first one to bring it up, these three types of barks. And what we do know is terriers and dachshunds have multiple barks that they use when they're hunting alongside humans for boar, partridge, hare, and fox. They have a different bark for each of those species that they're hunting. Now, Vicente argued that wolves have a bark, and he primarily studies captive wolves, right? It's a lot harder over there. But wolves have a bark that's really directed at other wolves in the pack. I call it a competitive bark. It's very fast-paced, it's a little higher pitched, and they do it with one another, often in play context, sometimes in a little bit of aggressive context. There's also a combative bark where wolves are barking at another pack. And it's a little lower pitched, a little longer in duration. And then there's a third type of bark that's often referred to as a woof. And he showed that, at least in captive facilities, that woofs are more frequently used directed at humans. And we've seen in the park that also is true, that these woof barks are directed at humans who might be walking by a recorder and they don't know a wolf's there, and you'll hear this wolf woof on a recorder. So those would be three different sound units that mean three different things, but they're all in the same class of words. And sometimes we call those synonyms in human languages, where words that mean kind of the same thing. So for me, a bark is like be forewarned. That's the root meaning, like be forewarned. But you might direct it. It might have a little more subtle variation directed at a particular be forewarned. If you're directing it at your pack mate, that's a different be forewarned than at a human who's approaching. And I often think of these woofs as an uncertainty in wolves, but they can hear it. They can hear when another pack mate is doing a woof bark and respond accordingly. So that's one example of several that we're finding that are panning out, that are being validated by other researchers as well.
Yeah, and it's really fascinating and exciting to see that other researchers across the globe are taking this in stride and helping with these types of linguistic research and making these notes, sharing them with you, and that there is this partnership across oceans and across the globe, that people are able to see these vocalizations are starting to mean something, and that they're different, maybe in different parts of the world, because, like you say, of human presence. It's a little bit more urbanized. There's a little bit less wild, dense forest. It kind of depends on what you're talking about at a sanctuary or in a domesticated part there. This is all just really fascinating to me, that, like, talking about language and talking about this. I wanted to go back and ask about the harmonics or the frequencies, because I think you mentioned sort of the decibel, like where the range, and you said, I think it was 100 dBs, right? Was where, like, if you're in a chorus, if you hear a chorus howl, we're talking about 100 dBs, which is pretty roughly ish, right?
Per howl, like, so
Or howl, yeah.
howl is about 100 decibels. So collectively, they would also possibly be 100 decibels, might amplify a little more. But yeah, think of 100 decibels and think of that car horn.
Man, that's crazy, because when you look, it's what I equate that to is when I watch sports and they sometimes bring up that decibel meter because they, you know, they want to measure the crowd and see how loud the crowd is and stuff. And they get to that 100 decibels is usually the point where people get like really amped up, and it's really deafening. So for that to be resonating throughout open landscape is pretty incredible. You know, if you're talking about 10 wolves, it's, let's just say 10 wolves in a group howling, it's somewhat equivalent, like you said, to the car horn, and then also to a stadium full of people who are cheering their team on, which is an enormous amount of sound to be produced by just those 10 animals. That's pretty wild.
The other twist in there is that low frequencies generally travel farther than higher frequencies. And an example of that is if you see lightning at a long ways away, you will hear the thunder, what we refer to as thunder, like the rumbling. But if lightning hits close to you, like half mile away, you're going to hear a crack and the thunder. The crack is the high frequency sound that it's created. That rolling rumble is the low frequencies. So when it's far away, you don't hear the crack because it doesn't get to you. It gets attenuated by the air and objects. Low frequencies, bigger waves travel through and around things better. And it's why elephants can talk at such far ranges. It's even traveling through the ground. Their rumbles are traveling through the ground. So wolves howl at about, on average, this is an average, 350 hertz, which is middle F on your piano keyboard. You and I are talking roughly, you know, between 80 to 250 hertz, depends on the person. So they're a little higher than that, but the duration of their howl on average, like in Yellowstone, the average howl is like 6 seconds. They can be as short as 1, they can be as long as 10, 12. But that longer howl and the low frequency and that bigger amplitude allow it to travel farther. And so if you're a long-ranging animal, it makes sense that evolution would select for this vocal characteristic that allows you to howl that way. And if you think about a wolf's mouth, right, there's a thing called resonance, a resonance chamber in all of us that amplifies certain frequencies. A wolf's mouth is, on average, the length is around what matches the wavelength of that 350 hertz middle F, you know, on your piano keyboard sound. So it's not only that low frequency travels farther, it's being amplified by their vocal tract.
Wow.
Like, you know, a blowhorn or...
Like a blowhorn, yeah. Holy cow. I want to ask if, and I don't know if this was brought up in your talk, and I don't know if I finished the entire thing, but you were getting into a little bit about actions and communications of other species reacting to, like if a wolf pack makes a kill, for instance, there are different sounds, and I think you pointed out one of your colleagues or someone you knew in the crowd for this particular talk to make that raven sound or that call that seemed to alert the other ravens there's a kill or there's food down there. Is this another possibility, another research angle that can be brought from these recorders? Is if it's by, like you say, a kill site or a carcass site, that you'll be able to pick up different types of sounds from either the birds, the wolves that are already there, who knows, the coyotes, the fox, whatever it is that you guys can pick up, and cross-reference those with different wavelengths, different communication to say, if there's a kill site, we are seeing these specific communications throughout the entire animal kingdom, at least in this spot, to say, hey, come here, there's food, there's dinner or whatever on the table.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's what I meant by there's 1,000 PhDs that could be done on this. Nothing to do with wolves per se, right? Because the recorders are picking up every sound. And that raven, often referred to as a meat call, or I just call it a food call. It's kind of a higher pitched, shorter call that ravens often make when they've found food, not just a wolf kill, but any food. So there's all of these interspecies interactions. I've noticed, like we had put a bison rut in the fall, like in August in the park, and they get in these epic battles, and some of them die, right? And that carcass becomes food. And this bull bison had died next to one of our recorders. And so we had this epic recording day because a bunch of grizzly bears came in. A bison came in and walked around the bison and made these interesting vocalizations. I'm like, is that a morning call? I don't know, right? Ravens were there. Then the wolves came in. But what I noticed about the wolves and the bison, people were watching this like from a mile away through their scopes. And this recorder was picking up all of the sounds very close up, right, that they couldn't hear. And I noticed that the wolves growl, right? You've heard them growl before. Yep. And when they're growling at a grizzly bear that's on the same carcass, their growls go very low, down to 50 hertz. It's just really low growl. And to bring up kind of back to your point of like, how can we learn some of this? Well, some of this stuff we can learn from canids, because canids can be, dogs, domestic dogs, they can be studied in a non-invasive, ethical way. There's various researchers who train border collies to sit in an fMRI, and they're learning, like, how does their brain respond to human speech, for example? Or this thing called an N400, where I don't want to get too far off track, but you asked it earlier, and it's kind of important. If I take my dog or you take your dog, and I take two objects its nose, like a ball and a Frisbee, and I do that to my border collie, they know what these words are. And I hold them behind my back and I say ball. And then I bring out the ball and I show them the ball behind my back. And they're like, looking right at me, ready to go. And I put it back. And then I say Frisbee. I hold out the Frisbee. And then I say ball. And I hold out the Frisbee. These researchers have shown that they have this delayed response called an N400. That's exactly like humans when we are given a word that doesn't match what we expected. And so their brains are working, at least in some similar ways to ours in language. And what they showed with dogs as well is that if you put a dog, everybody knows this, like if you walk up to a dog that's got a nice juicy bone, you're going to get a different growl than if, it just doesn't like you or know you and you walk up to it. That is a growl that means you do not even come one step closer. It's a very low growl. And they've shown that other dogs know that growl. And they know, okay, just keep your distance,
Keep your distance, yeah.
So back to the bison that had died, we're picking up those sounds to tell these stories that there's meaning, there's function in that growl when a grizzly bear is nearby that's different than if they're just doing it at another wolf. And so all of those, the context of wolf communication involves much more than just wolves or humans. It involves grizzly bears and other species that they interact with.
Wow. Do you feel that this is, aside from the research part of it, which we've gone really in depth about, and the possibilities are endless here, do you feel this is also an opportunity to, as you just said, share stories with this communication? And I want to sort of go into five-toed wolf, because you had mentioned you wanted me to sort of bring this up a little bit, and what that means for anybody who's listening. And this certainly can be a possibility for people to be able to share these stories of pack dynamics, share stories of other things that happen on the landscape that, as you say, we can put it into our human language and say this is what we believe, but then ultimately we might be able to share stories through their own communication. Do you see that as something that could happen on down the line?
Yeah, and I guess you should survey your audience after they listen to this and say, did they hear anything that brings a different level of understanding that maybe brings a different level of compassion. I don't know what the word is, right? Everybody goes through their own journey of figuring out, why does the wild world mean more to them than just killing them. I can give you one more example.
Sure.
That I love. Now, this is highly disputed, which I love, because I've sent this to a bunch of researchers and no one believes me just yet, but someone just finally did. So we had recorders at 4 den sites this summer. And so we were recording everything at the den site. Pups tend to start howling about 20 days after they're born. And so we've got these epic puppies howling next to their mother, howling, all that cool stuff. But I noticed something, because I've listened to a lot of wolves, and I noticed something at these recorders, that the pitch, that fundamental frequency of the alpha females who had given birth was unusually low. So 907, who normally howls at 320 hertz, which is already low because she's about 110 pounds, which is a whole nother topic. Do bigger wolves howl lower? She was howling down in 250 hertz. It is so low, I could share it with you. And I'm like, who is the big bad wolf at the den site howling? And I finally figured out that these low-pitched howls were coming from the females, the alpha females. I'm like, why? Why are they doing that? Well, one theory was they're howling lower because they want to make themselves look bigger and keep enemies away from their pups. And I'm like, yeah, I don't buy that. Because what happened is their howl went back to normal at about 2 months. It took a while for it to go back to their normal kind of pitch. And it could be true that they're behaviorally adjusting. But one of the myths out there about wolves at den sites is that they don't howl as much, that they're quiet, right? Because you don't want to get detected and have your pups get killed. They howl like crazy at den sites, like crazy, just as frequently as at other sites. So I finally okay, let's use ChatGPT. Let's go do some homework. And what I ended up with, long story short, is in human, I kind of knew this, but this is not my field. Female humans have vocal cord changes due to sex hormones, due to pregnancy. When the placenta is released from birth, huge changes happen in your sex hormones immediately. And there has been this hypothesis that it changes women's voices. There's lots of popular books on this matter, but I wanted to find someone who actually knew what they're talking about. And last week she got back to me and she's like, well, here's my latest paper. And it's kind of definitive that there are changes in Homo sapien females due to sex hormones. Not all of them, but many of them. And she's like, I would really love to look for this in other species. And so what I've been proposing is that their pitches change because they're pregnant. And it goes back to normal after everything gets more balanced. And I won't get into the details of why, but to me, I've never had a baby, right? And nor do I pretend to. All I know is for the women who have, they remind me that it is not fun, right? And there's lots of changes you go through. And just to identify with a female wolf and know that all of these biological changes are happening to you, I think that draws you closer to them, if this proves out. And so it's just another story of we are animals too, right? We're animals too.
Yeah. Wow. Man, there's just, like you said, there's just so many different avenues to travel with all of this. And it's truly fascinating and just very, very interesting. And I cannot wait for the continuation of all of this stuff. But I did want you to go into five-toed wolf and what that meant. You told me to mention this, and I'm a man of my word. So tell me first of all, tell everybody what five-toed wolf is and how it came to be and what this is all about.
Well, thank you, John. You didn't have to mention it, but now that
No, I'd like to. Yeah.
five-toed wolf was just a crazy idea. People like howls, right? It's probably, if not one of the most familiar sounds in nature, right? One of the most epic sounds in nature. Whether you like them or not, right? People identify with the wolf howl. And back in 1970, Roger and Katie Payne issued an album called Songs of the Humpback Whale. And it changed the course of whale conservation. And in fact, it was so popular that a portion of that album is on the Voyager spacecraft flying somewhere in interstellar space, right? Very popular. Well, in 1971, an album came out narrated by none other than Robert Redford.
Yep.
I think it was called The Music of Wolves. Other than the title, which I don't like, as you know, it was an epic album. And John and Mary Taburge, who study wolves here in Yellowstone, contributed to a lot of that. That was in 1971. What didn't exist in Yellowstone in 1971? Wolves, right? And so as we started this Bioacoustics project, we were sitting down and I'm working on a book on this topic of wolf communication. And I'm thinking, what people want out of a book is they want to hear wolves, right? They don't want to hear me ramble on. And so I'm like, what would be really cool is just to recreate an album post reintroduction, honoring those albums of the past and what they meant with one of the most iconic sounds in nature. And so I went to ChatGPT and I said, create me an album, a vinyl album cover with a wolf print and a waveform, a form of a spectrogram in it. And it took me like 100 tries. And then finally it popped out with this really cool album. And I'm like, that's cool. I set it aside. A week later, I came back and I looked at it and I'm like, there are 5 pads on this wolf, right? 5 toes, right? And as we all know, like wolves do technically have 5 toes on the front feet, right? They do claw, whatever you want to call it. But they don't have 5 pads that you see in a print. Right. And so I just thought it was cool how AI is helping us decode animals, but AI is not perfect, right? It doesn't get everything right. So I left it with 5 toes as just a reminder myself that us just listening to these animals and spending time with them is the way we're going to start really relearning what the Tukadika already knew. And so for me, it was kind of fun. So we created an album, a digital album, where you can go and for like $10 play these sounds of wolves from Yellowstone all the way back to 1995 on one side, and on the other side, every other year, we're going to issue an album that has a side of a particular pack and the sounds we recorded for that year. So you'll get the wolves of the past and the wolves of the present in one album, and the rock band is called Five-Toed Wolf. So that's the story behind it, and all of that money goes to wolf conservation organizations.
That's tremendous. That's very, very cool. We actually had a podcast with Will Stenberg and his brother, and they said that Robert Redford album was such a huge influence on them as kids. So clearly I cannot imagine this will not be a massive hit and also be something that will just continue to push conservation and preservation forward more as we move into the future. Jeff, for anybody, and we're going to have a ton of links in the description, what are ways that people can help the research, donate, anything like that, and where they can find the latest information on what's happening, if there's traveling talks, things like that from you and so on and so forth? Where can they all go and find this stuff?
Yeah, we'll keep the website up to date. So the link that you'll provide, it's a website called The Languages of Life. And that's for all sorts of species around the greater Yellowstone, but there's a particular section on there for wolves. And we'll keep that up to date. We'll post talks on there and whatnot. The Washington Post just covered us this week. More importantly than how can you help is next time you walk outside, just stop and listen. and listen to the rest of the wild world, because they are talking. And I think that will drive your passion. And whatever your passion is, put your energies into that. And I put my energies into my local area. I spend time rewilding this local area. And people are like, why do you rewild there? You've got one of the wild places in the world. And I'm like, it's at risk. There's huge risk. Taylor Sheridan, his stupid TV show, Yellowstone, is just crashing down on this area with people buying second homes. And if you cut off the migration corridors of elk and deer and others, you won't have wolves, right? And so I focus my energies here, and I encourage people to focus their energies where they are, where they can make the most difference. But, you asked, so if you want to help, Yellowstone Forever is the nonprofit arm of Yellowstone National Park. And if you want to give to them, you can just earmark the Cry Wolf Bioacoustics project if you wanted to donate money. And so go to YF's website, earmark that, and we're going to keep doing everything we can to tell these stories, provide that data and research to people all across the world, and interact and help them. So thank you for asking.
Absolutely. Anytime. My last question for you, Jeff, is when you hear the word wolf, what is the thing that comes to your mind?
And you stumped me. I guess I would say howl. For me, and maybe that's just because I'm deep in it, but when I hear the wolf, I don't get emotional about it anymore. I've lived through a lot with them. 4 of them were just killed not far from me by a person they were trying to establish a pack not far from my home, and they were just killed this last week. And I've dealt with that for a long time. But when someone says wolf, I think howl. And that's where I spend my passion. I was trying to understand that communication and what it means to me.
Tremendous. Awesome work. Jeff Reed, keep doing what you're doing, listening to those howls, rewilding, and doing all the wonderful things that you, your team, and everybody else is doing up there in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Really appreciate your time, and can't thank you enough for all the incredible information you gave us.
Yeah, thank you, John, and everything you do. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. How's to you all out there? We'll be with you next time. Bye, everybody. Looking for more information about Wolf Connection or the podcast? Please visit our website at wolfconnection.org, where you can donate, sponsor a wolf, or become a volunteer.